330 episodes in, and I'm noticing a pattern when it comes to 90s shareware. So much of it was developed either by Apogee or Epic Mega Games, and the one thing I've noticed, more so with Apogee titles than with Epic titles, is that Apogee titles were hit and miss in terms of the content provided beyond the shareware release. Some like Commander Keen and Terminal Velocity got it right, providing new graphics to check out, new obstacles and enemies, new worlds to explore, new bosses to face, and sometimes even new weapons to add to your arsenal. But then you had games like Dark Ages and even the original Duke Nukem, which were really just level expansions, not really adding much if anything in the way of new content beyond new levels using the same assets. However, one particular game which sticks in my mind is Cosmo's Cosmic Adventure, particularly because that game gives you a false impression as to the overall difficulty of the experience, whereby the shareware version has a mild to moderate level of difficulty, and then playing the full game is like you suddenly found yourself playing Battletoads. Well, today's Ancient DOS game is Realms of Chaos, one of the last games to use the Apogee name, and one which feels like an extreme example of both the best and worst things Apogee had put out. Since on the surface, playing the shareware episode, it seems like it's going to be a fun time. But then once you get into the registered content, the difficulty spirals out of control, something fierce. Heck, this isn't even a long game. You can beat the entire thing, all 3 episodes, in less than an hour if you know exactly where to go and what to do. But your first time through, once you get past the first episode and into the registered content, the game is gonna murder you constantly and take joy in doing so. Now true, you can mitigate some of the difficulty by abusing the saving and loading mechanics, just like with the later Commander Keen titles, and in fact the game flat out encourages you to do this, but I'll have a lot more to say about the difficulty later because it's important to understand everything else about the game first to understand why the difficulty gets as nuts as it does. Also, one other quick thing before we get started, back in episode 290 of Ancient DOS Games, I covered an indie title by the name of Inner Worlds, and commented that it felt inspired by Jill of the Jungle, which it definitely was. But now that I've played Realms of Chaos, I think Inner Worlds was inspired just as much by this game as it was by Jill of the Jungle. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say that Inner Worlds is almost like a cross between Jill of the Jungle and Realms of Chaos. Also, I'm playing with the blood effects turned off because they're not that good, because I can, and because that way I don't have to age gate the video. Realms of Chaos was developed and published by Apogee near the end of 1995 and is a one-player platformer, supporting VGA 320x200 256 color graphics and a decent array of audio devices. As for its current release date, it's still shareware, and the simplest way to obtain it nowadays is to buy a digital copy. It's technically cheaper on Steam by $1, but goes on sale much more frequently on GOG, and always for dirt cheap. So it's best to wait for sales to occur, then scope out which is the best price, because those sales are very frequent. Physical copies though, good freaking luck. I found a handful of loose copies for sale, and that was it, with the prices being mostly around the $30 to $60 mark, and I didn't find any boxed copies for sale anywhere. Though I do know boxed copies exist because I've seen pictures of the box. Thus, if you want a physical copy, keep your eyes peeled because they do not show up often, and be prepared to spend a little more than a typical PC game. And if you just want to play the game, get a digital download on sale. Skipping on the story section because there's not much of one. You play the role of a brother and sister duo known as Endrick and Alondra, who are essentially known as heroes for hire throughout their world of Mysteria. Now, over a period of years, a strange darkness creeps over the world, which causes the various races to cut ties with each other. Then weird aliens attack, and both Endrick and Alondra decide to set out to make things right and push back this vile darkness. And apparently the story here also ties in with earlier Apogee titles, which isn't actually revealed until you beat the game, so that's a thing. Also, one thing I find a little ridiculous is that Endrick and Alondra have profiles you can look up in the instructions, whereby Endrick is given a turn-on of chocolate, and Alondra apparently hates poodles. Yeah, great way to make me not care about these characters, though admittedly, I've seen far worse character profiles, so I mean, it is what it is, let's just move on. So the basic gameplay itself takes place across 3 episodes, though before you begin you have to set your difficulty setting between one of 5 options: super easy, practice, normal, Challenge, and Psycho Warrior. The game doesn't really explain the differences, but the way it works is that normal is the normal method of play, practice starts you with 1 extra point of maximum health and 1 weapon power-up, super easy starts you with 2 extra points of maximum health, 2 weapon power-ups, 100 mana crystals, and disables knockback, challenge simply doubles the damage you take from half a point to a full point, and Psycho Warrior both doubles the damage you take and reduces Endrick's starting health by 1 point, but otherwise seems very similar to the challenge mode. Also, challenge difficulty and Psycho Warrior difficulty have an extra mechanic added known as poison, whereby sometimes an enemy will drop a poison flask you absolutely do not want to pick up, plus some enemies can have poisonous attacks. If one of your 2 characters is poisoned, that character will take constant damage over a period of time until either they die or you pick up a health potion with them. Unfortunately, poison only ticks down while you're playing as a character, so if a character gets poisoned, it's best to switch to a different character. Again though, poison is not present in the normal game mode. The goal of each level is usually to get to the end, though some are instead boss fights, where the level ends once the boss is defeated. The first episode only has a single boss, while the second and third episodes each have 2 bosses, one midway through and one at the end. However, the levels themselves serve as a means to power yourself up, notably in regards to health, mana, and weapons. Mana is actually the most obvious factor, so let's cover that one first. Alondra is strictly a magic user and can only attack with magic, thus every mana gem you pick up equates to being able to fire a single fireball with her. Now Alondra's magic does less damage than Endrick's sword, but has no attack delay and no range limit, when it's short of the edge of the screen. Plus you can fire Alondra's magic straight up, which is absolutely necessary to survive climbing up to higher areas in some levels. You also need to spend magic crystals to pick up magic artifacts, which you sometimes find hidden inside statues. The magic artifacts come in 4 flavors: a shield which costs 25 mana and generates 5 spinning orbs around your character which can intersect both enemies and projectiles, a very brief invulnerability artifact which costs 15 mana and is almost never worth it, especially since something I found out at one point is that spikes can still kill you when you're invulnerable, a Death Blast, which costs 25 mana, which flashes the screen for a moment and causes enemies to immediately die if they're on screen while the flash is occurring. But the most important artifact is the Weapon Power-Up, which costs 50 mana and gives you a permanent damage increase for both Endrick and Alondra for the rest of an episode, which you can find 2 of in each episode. At least, I think you can find 2 in each episode? More on that later. As for health, this ties into your score. While it's not shown on screen, the game does keep track of your score over the course of an episode, which you can bring up with the F6 key. Every 10,000 points you get will refill Endrick and Alondra's to maximum health and provide an extra unit of maximum health, up to a hard limit of 5 health for both characters. The thing that's weird about this though is that it's actually really hard to get 10,000 points. It doesn't sound like a lot, but most of the drops you get from enemies are only worth 50 or 100, sometimes 200 and on rare occasions 500, while the enemies themselves are worth nothing. Now, enemies typically do drop items, but it's always completely random items, thus when and where you'll get your health upgrades will vary wildly between multiple playthroughs. Now that said, you can sometimes find very valuable drops in the statues, which can be worth up to 1,000 points. So as long as you're finding all the statues and defeating as many enemies as you can, and not letting their drops time out, given that they disappear very quickly, you should generally get at least 2 maximum health upgrades before the final boss of an episode. Finding the statues though is a big crux of the game. Many statues are out in the open and easy to get, but the ones which are going to matter the most are typically hidden, either requiring you to scroll the screen in just the right spot using your ability to look up or down on command, which will then cause the statue to fall out of the sky, or they can also be hidden in secret areas, with the secret areas in this game being a chore to find. Secrets come in 2 flavors, either being floors you can step on which don't look like you could step on them, sometimes because they're just flat out invisible, or being walls you can walk through which have no obvious way of telling you can walk through them, though a handful of them do have subtle indications that there's secrets beyond. Though also keep in mind, you can crouch walk in this game, and it's actually necessary to do this to get into some secret areas. Other than that though, it's all about surviving the levels and the enemies thrown at you. So, speaking of that, Now, I get some flack sometimes when I talk about level design because people will often tell me there's nothing wrong with it. I just need to get good or something stupid like that. But before I go into why the level design here is abysmal, let me let you all in on a little secret. There is a very simple test you can do to determine if the level design in a game is legitimately difficult or if the level design is actually bad. And that test simply is, are there any spots you cannot survive without knowing ahead of time what's about to happen? Unfortunately, this game fails that test. So the start of the game is not actually that bad. The knockback does make it a little challenging in terms of dealing with instant death pits and spikes, but if you got any experience with the Castlevania series, then this isn't going to be anything unusual. In fact, there seems to be a good bit of Castlevania inspiration coursing through this thing, such as with these fire-spitting statues which shoot high to the left and shoot low to the right, requiring different approaches to take them out depending on which side of them you're on. But let's start with one of the more egregious failings of the level design, in that some of the enemies are random and can respawn. Now, these kinds of enemies in particular have a tendency to respawn very shortly after you take them out, and their spawn point is random to some degree, meaning if you're not prepared for them, they can knock you back into instant death with little effort. And the only saving grace is that enemies which can respawn do have a limit in terms of how many times they're allowed to respawn, so eventually they will stop respawning. And you can tell this is happening because when you reach the end of a level, you get a count in terms of how many different enemies you faced, and every time you play through a level a second or third time, you may indeed see a different enemy count if random enemies were indeed present. I don't think every level has them though, but a lot of them do. The next major failing of the level design is one which actually doesn't rear its head until partway through the second episode and has to do with something incredibly subtle which you may not even realize is happening. Alondra can jump very slightly higher than Endrick, and I measured, it's only about 9 or 10 pixels depending on where the collision detection is taking place. But partway through the second episode, you reach a point where it seems impossible to proceed any further, yet the way you're supposed to proceed is to switch to Alondra and make a very specific jump, which just barely reaches the lowest point of the edge of a mushroom above you. Worse still, because this jump is so incredibly tight, you can attempt it, do it completely right, and still miss it because I'm pretty sure subpixels are a factor. In fact, I can prove it. Watch what happens if I attempt this jump holding nothing but the jump button from the exact same spot multiple times in a row. I mean, excuse me? What changed? Why was I suddenly allowed up there when my previous jumps didn't work? Again, you have to go this way to beat this level, yet this jump is impossible as Endrick and only sometimes possible as Alondra. Now, if you get even closer to the edge, it is a little more consistent, but the fact that it can fail at all from the exact same starting state and then sometimes work is some serious jank. Now true, some of this is mitigated by the fact that you have unlimited lives, by the fact that the levels are not very big, and by the fact that you can save and load anytime you want, and the game state will be exactly as you saved it. Not to mention, if you save in such a state that you can't succeed, your save still remembers how you entered the level. Thus, you just have to skip loading your quick save and the level restarts from the beginning as you had entered it before. Save scumming pretty much becomes a requirement to make any progress given the level of difficulty on display. And the irony is, the game knows this. As such, there are spots in a couple of the levels where if you make a mistake, but quick save that mistake before you realize it even is a mistake, you literally cannot finish the level and have to start it over from the beginning. One of the worst contenders for this is actually the second last level of the entire game, which features a set of tiny blocks which appear and disappear in sequence, forming an appearing and disappearing trail to follow. Now, at one point early in the level, I was led off of those trailing blocks, so I figured that was it for that, or that maybe there'd be another one later. Thus, I made a little more progress, quick saved, and continued. Only to realize that the block trail was still going, and I was supposed to race back over to where it would end up to continue making progress. Instead, I end up missing it, unable to make any more progress, and no, it does not come back. It does not respawn, and once it's done its thing, it does not do it again no matter how long you wait for it. I had to go jump in some spikes and hit N to the quick save reloading to start the level over again. Now going back to what I said before though, there's a couple spots where if you don't know what's about to happen ahead of time, you're dead. The first such instance I ran into was here in the second episode, where you can see this sort of orb moving around down below. That's the only such orb I know of in the entire game, so I figured it might be something special. But what ends up happening when you approach the area this orb is in, before you can even see it, is that you suddenly lose all control and end up helplessly walking straight towards it until you fall into some instant death spikes you didn't know were there until it was too late. Late in the third episode is another spot where you have a hole to jump down, but you need to hug the left wall during the jump down, which isn't made immediately obvious, and by the time you realize you need to do it, you're only frames away from landing in instant death spikes. I think the worst offense of all, though, is that the game is intentionally built for you to find the weapon power-ups. Each weapon power-up makes you considerably stronger, which plays a huge factor in how the boss fights turn out. During my run through the game, I managed to find only one weapon power-up in the first episode, and the boss there had a bit of a trick to it, which, once you figure out that trick, isn't so bad no matter how powered up you are. The first boss of the third episode is a gimmick boss where you need to smack its head into its body, so the weapon power-ups don't really apply. And then the final boss of the entire game, I had fully powered weapons, so even though it was a challenging fight, I was able to do enough damage to outpace the damage it did to me once I learned how to avoid some of its attacks, though not all of them. The bosses of the second episode, though, are the worst of them all. Both bosses seem tailor-made for Alondra to fight instead of Endrick, as with Endrick you need to do jumping slashes to hit them, and because there is a massive delay between hitting the attack button and Endrick swinging his sword, it can be very hard to get the timing down, especially since if you take damage before the sword swing comes out, you don't get your sword swing at all. And with the first boss though, I had a very strange experience in that I got the boss's HP down and chopped its head off, but then, what's supposed to happen next? I sat here watching this now decapitated neck wiggling around for over a minute and nothing was happening. Silly me, I'd also hit quick save so I could quick load and try to fix this, not realizing I didn't have a backup save, and when I quick loaded, this just kept going. I eventually watched a video online to see what was supposed to happen, and sure enough, I somehow glitched out the boss and ended up soft-locked, and because I had quick saved in this state, and because there was no way to take damage, I had to start the entire episode over from the start. The last boss of the second episode though, to say this fight was rough would be an understatement. Now in the first episode I found one weapon power-up, in the third I found both, but across the entire length of the second episode I found no weapon power-ups, and my final tally at the end indicated I found all but 3 statues, meaning 2 of those 3 statues I missed must have had weapon power-ups in them. So I didn't miss them per lack of trying, I just got really unlucky and missed the specific ones I needed. Even just a single weapon power-up would have helped, but no, I had to fight this nightmare of a boss with only minimal damage output. The way this boss works is that it spits out 6 acid balls at you, which are aimed extremely well, plus the particles, which splash outward from the impact, can also hurt you. Now following this, the head detaches and starts bouncing around, with every bounce causing debris to fall from the ceiling in several random spots. Literally everything moving on the screen during these segments causes damage. Then the head will float up to the ceiling and can only be reached either by shooting fireballs straight up or by jumping up the moving segments of the body to get a better vantage for attacking directly, with the segments being able to instantly kill you if they squish you against the wall or freaking against the open edge of the screen, which was extremely annoying. This boss seemed impossible during my first 15 minutes of fighting it, so I went online to find a video showcasing how to beat it. Well, the solution I found online was to play the game on super easy difficulty and then ravage the boss with fireballs to outpace the damage it does you in return. So yeah, I spent an hour trying this boss over and over and over again, trying to figure out how in the world to survive it given no weapon power-ups. The answer to survival primarily came down to focusing on dodging at all moments except when it's flying along the ceiling. Then do as much damage as you can as Endrick to keep Alondra as healed as possible. Then once Endrick is spent, switch to Alondra and just toss fireballs indiscriminately whenever you don't have to worry about dodging. The way this fight turned out, I'm about 99% positive no one on the face of the planet had beaten it with 0 weapon power-ups until I set myself the task to do it. This boss was clearly designed to be faced with at least 1 weapon power-up to double your damage output, because in most of my attempts prior to finally making it work, I was getting the boss down almost halfway. 1 weapon power-up would have made a huge difference, 2 would have made it even easier. But I did finally do it. It's one of the hardest boss fights I've ever successfully accomplished, and anyone who's been telling me I'm bad at games can just go jump in a dumpster. But then, why do I consider that bad level design? Because when you're making a game of any kind with secrets, it's up to you as the designer to ensure that the game can be cleared without finding those secrets, because you cannot expect people to find them. Now, this is actually why I consider the first Bayonetta game to be poorly designed in terms of raw gameplay, because that's already a difficult game, yet if you miss any of its secrets, it gets even harder. To the point where if you're just trying to go through it and don't care about the secrets, you're eventually going to hit a point where the difficulty is just insane. All because you decided not to go hunting for secrets. I mean, shame on you for just wanting to play through the game and see the story unfold. Overall, Realms of Chaos has all the makings of a really good game, except for the level design. Well, that and the music is probably some of the weakest Bobby Prince has ever made, as it's really only average at best. But because the main failing is the level design, it ends up being one of those games where you're gonna have a good time once you know exactly how to get through every level and find every secret, but until you do, the frustration factor is astronomical come the 2nd and 3rd episodes. And I guess what I'm trying to say really is that the game as a whole is not bad. It's just extremely hard to get into as someone who's never played it before because of how antagonistic the level design is. Curiously, this is one of the few games where you have to manually set the cycles count to max when running it in DOSBox, because it doesn't seem to use a typical protected mode handler, such as DOS4GW, and it needs way more cycles than the auto setting will provide on its own. Other than that though, it should run without any extra configuration. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now, on August 10th, will be another review, episode 331, where we're going to be taking a look at an even more indie title than this one, often considered to be like Wing Commander, but in 2 dimensions. Yeah, definitely make sure to stay tuned to see if those claims turn out to be true. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the people seen here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join in with them and support the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.